26 September 1983. Serpukhov 1-5, Moscow Oblast. Shortly after midnight Moscow time, a newly deployed Soviet early warning satellite architecture generates a launch alarm under conditions its designers believed were unlikely. The operational expectation is binary. Either the system sees nothing, or it sees the unmistakable infrared signature of American ICBMs rising above the Earth's limb. Instead, the display logic produces a sequence of attack indications that begins small and then escalates. In a system designed to buy decision time, the most dangerous failure mode is not silence, it is confidence. On the console, classification reads, highest reliability. In the bunker, a duty officer faces a choice that protocol narrows to one verb: report. The geometry of the season and orbit has aligned so as to maximize sunlight reflected from high-altitude clouds into the sensor's field of view. This outline follows the next minutes and the institutional context around them, because the true near-miss is not one man versus one screen, but an entire warning chain under stress. The war scare baseline matters. In 1981, Soviet intelligence services went on alert under a collection program known as Operation Ryan, an acronym translating roughly as nuclear missile attack. The doctrinal expectation inside Moscow's security organs was that warning indicators could be collected early enough to prevent surprise. The reality, as declassified US intelligence assessments later described, was that intelligence alerts could prime institutions to interpret ambiguous signals as confirmation. A heightened warning posture increases the cost of false positives because institutions may compress deliberation time. The early warning system's purpose is to reduce surprise, yet, in a war scare, the same system can amplify surprise by accelerating uncertainty. The Petrov night occurs inside this documented context, not as an isolated technical glitch, but as a single node in a broader institutional nervousness. Declassified monographs describe the period as one in which Soviet leadership explicitly discussed miscalculation risk. In a documented statement attributed to then General Secretary Yuri Andropov, preserved in National Security Archive briefings, the concern is blunt. After all, at the button could be a drunken American sergeant or a drug addict. The statement reflects a leadership mindset in which the fear is not merely enemy intent, but error on either side. Early warning, in this architecture, is a chain. Space sensors detect, ground radars confirm as the trajectory rises, command centers assess, leadership issues, readiness, or retaliatory steps. Each link is designed to catch mistakes, yet each link also creates pressure to act before the next stage confirms or disconfirms. In 1983, that chain is under stress. 3 weeks before the Petrov incident, Korean Airlines Flight 007 strays into Soviet airspace and is shot down, killing all 269 aboard. The international reaction is fierce. Soviet military units are on heightened alert. Arms control negotiations are stalled. The backdrop is a strategic environment in which both superpowers maintain arsenals capable of ending industrial civilization within hours, and in which each side fears the other might strike first under the cover of an exercise or diplomatic crisis. Into this environment, the Soviet Union has recently deployed a new space-based early warning segment. The system is called Oko-Russian for Eye. Its mission is to detect the infrared signatures of ballistic missile launches from US territory earlier than ground-based radars can. The satellites orbit in highly elliptical paths, known as Molniya orbits, which provide long dwell time over northern latitudes and repeated looks at American missile fields. The design intent is to extend warning time, giving Soviet leadership minutes, rather than seconds, to assess an attack and decide on retaliation. But the system is new, and new systems, as engineers know, carry risks that only operational use reveals. The facility that receives Oko's data is Serpukhov 1-5, a command post south of Moscow. It is not a launch site, it is an information hub. The duty officers there do not command missile forces. Their job is narrower, and in some ways more dangerous. They classify incoming data and report assessments up the chain. They transform sensor signals into strategic judgments. On the night of 26 September, that transformation will become the hinge of history. If leadership already believes miscalculation is possible, How much proof does a warning system need before it changes force posture? The answer, it turns out, depends on who is watching the screen. The early warning space segment is described in technical reconstructions as new and narrative shaping, a system designed to detect launches from US missile fields earlier than ground radar could. Popular retellings often assume the Soviet Union would launch on warning that a satellite alarm could directly trigger retaliation. A specialist analysis cautions that this is not a safe assumption. Soviet posture emphasized assured retaliation, what analysts call a deep second strike. The role of early warning is more plausibly to trigger preliminary readiness steps, communications checks, command post-activation, force posture changes, rather than immediate launch. Yet even preliminary steps are dangerous in a crisis. Readiness actions can be observed by the other side. They can be misinterpreted. They can accelerate a spiral. The purpose of early warning is to reduce surprise, but the mechanism by which it does so, by collapsing decision time, can itself become a source of instability. At Serpukhov 1-5, the duty officer on the night of 26 September is Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. He is not a household name in 1983. He will not become one for years. His role is procedural. He is positioned to assess whether a satellite signal is credible enough to report as an actual attack assessment. If he judges the alarm real, he reports it upward. If he judges it false, he does not. The decision sounds simple. In practice, it requires contradicting an automated system designed to be trusted. OCO's design reflects a classic trade-off in sensor engineering. To detect missile launches reliably, the satellites look at the edge of the Earth, the limb, where the planet's surface meets the black background of space. A rising missile appears silhouetted, its hot exhaust plume creating a bright infrared signature against the cold. This viewing strategy reduces false alarms from bright terrain reflections. Under most conditions, it works well. But under rare solar geometry, even this strategy can be fooled if reflected sunlight enters the sensor pathway at the wrong angle. The system's designers are aware of this risk in theory. They believe it is unlikely. They are wrong. On the night of 26 September, the geometry of the season and orbit aligns so as to maximize sunlight reflected from high-altitude clouds into the sensor's field of view. The autumn equinox period creates a solar angle that, when paired with the satellite's position and certain cloud formations, produces an infrared signal the system cannot distinguish from a missile launch. The system's design reduces some false positives by looking at the Earth's edge, but on 26 September, that very geometry becomes the vulnerability. The dual phenomenology concept is central to understanding what happens next. Satellites detect an infrared event. Ground radars later confirm once the missile rises over the horizon. Both feed an assessment chain. The gap between satellite cue and radar confirmation is where institutional error can metastasize. It is also where human judgment must hold the line. A new space sensor can expand warning time, while simultaneously creating a new class of false alarm geometry problems. The OCO system is months old. It has not yet been tested by the full range of environmental conditions it will face, and on this night, the environment will test it in a way no simulation anticipated. September 1983 is brittle. The timeline of crisis markers stacked within weeks of the Petrov night is striking. 3 weeks prior, the Korean Airlines shoot-down, an event that hardens attitudes on both sides and raises the possibility of further confrontation. 2 months later, Able Archer 83, a NATO command post exercise that Soviet intelligence will interpret as potential cover for an actual attack. In between, the Petrov incident, which remains classified for years and does not enter the public narrative until after the Cold War ends. A National Security Archive briefing summarizes Soviet-side documentation. Operation Ryan's premise is to detect signs of a Western first strike and elevate reporting as a main objective. The framework treats nuclear war as a scenario that can be anticipated through observable indicators: unusual troop movements, communication surges, changes in alert status, diplomatic evacuations. The collection effort is intensive. It is also dangerous because it trains Soviet analysts to look for patterns that confirm their worst assumptions. The expectation is that centralized control prevents accidental war. The reality, reflected in Soviet-side statements preserved in archival presentations, is a stated fear that catastrophe could be triggered by the wrong person in the wrong moment. The Andropov line about the drunken sergeant or drug addict is not rhetorical flourish. It reflects a genuine concern within Soviet leadership that nuclear arsenals designed to be responsive might be too responsive, that the speed required for retaliation might create vulnerability to human or technical error. Early warning becomes actionable only when it is transformed into decisions. A satellite alarm, by itself, launches nothing, but it can trigger communications checks, open decision conferences, and initiate readiness transitions. These are preliminary command measures, steps that move forces into a state from which retaliation is possible, even if final launch requires later confirmation. In a tense environment, preliminary measures carry their own risks. They shorten reaction time. They increase the chance that ambiguous information becomes decisive. The Soviet Union's strategic posture in 1983 is structured around the principle of assured retaliation. Unlike some Western strategic concepts, which at times explored preemptive options or launch on warning doctrines, Soviet doctrine emphasizes survivability, the ability to absorb a first strike and retaliate from surviving forces. This approach implies that Soviet decision-makers would be unlikely to launch based solely on a satellite alarm, especially one that is unconfirmed by radar or other intelligence sources. Yet the distinction between unlikely and impossible is critical. In a war scare, the threshold for action may shift. A signal that would normally be questioned might be treated as credible. A readiness step that would normally be delayed might be accelerated. The most dangerous aspect of early warning in a crisis is not that it will automatically trigger catastrophe, but that it will compress the time available to distinguish reality from error. Early warning systems are designed to prevent surprise. In tense periods, they can amplify risk because leadership may weight ambiguous indicators differently. High attention reduces tolerance for ambiguity. Reduced tolerance raises the chance that a machine launch label becomes a political fact. The upcoming alert will not be a mass strike. It will look wrong, and that mismatch becomes the hinge of the night. Shortly after midnight Moscow time, an operational alarm is generated. Computer classification indicates an apparent missile launch. The key documentary detail, described in technical write-ups, emphasizes a rare alignment: sun, satellite orbit, and reflective cloud tops. The expectation is that any warning of a strategic launch is treated as time-critical and routed upward. The reality is that early warning is probabilistic. An indication must be assessed against plausibility, corroboration windows, and known system maturity. Petrov's role here is not mythic. It is procedural. He is positioned to assess whether the signal is credible enough to report as an actual attack assessment. The console shows an alert. The system's automated classification logic has flagged an event. In some retellings, the confidence level is described as highest. The display does not provide a camera feed or raw sensor data. It provides a processed conclusion: launch detected. The first question a trained operator asks is not, "Is this real?" but "What can I check right now?" The team at Serpukhov 1.5 examines internal consistency flags, channel status, message formatting, and whether other sensor paths are reporting anything. These are the immediate diagnostics available when radar confirmation is still minutes away. Initial skepticism delays attack classification. Delayed classification buys time but increases responsibility. The incident occurs at a moment when ground radar cannot instantly confirm. Line of sight and horizon limitations mean radar confirmation arrives later in the timeline. This is not a flaw unique to the Soviet system. It is inherent in the physics of detection. Satellites detect by looking down at the Earth's edge, where a missile's exhaust plume rises into view almost immediately after launch. Radars detect by looking up, and they can only see objects that are above their horizon, which, for a missile launched from the central United States, means the warhead must rise high enough in its trajectory to be visible from Soviet territory. The delay between satellite cue and radar confirmation is typically measured in minutes. Those minutes are the decision window. Petrov's immediate assessment, as later quoted in press accounts, is direct: something wrong with the system. It's not functioning properly. The phrasing is operational, not heroic. It reflects standard troubleshooting. When an instrument produces an unexpected result, the first hypothesis is instrument error, not that the world has changed. Yet the protocol expects the officer to treat the alert as real unless disproven. This is deliberate. The cost of missing a genuine attack is considered higher than the cost of a false alarm. The system is biased towards sensitivity. But sensitivity has a price, credible-looking false positives that can drive escalation. Minutes later, the console will add launches, turning one alert into a pattern. The system now indicates 4 more launches. Multiple mainstream summaries describe 5 missiles total. The escalation is exactly the kind of pattern a warning chain is built to fear. A single alert can be dismissed as a glitch. Multiple alerts create the appearance of confirmation. The gap between satellite cue and radar confirmation is where institutional error can metastasize. On this night, that gap will become the theater in which protocol and judgment collide. The Oko geometry matters. Soviet satellites are described as looking toward the edge of the Earth, so that a rising missile would appear silhouetted against space, reducing confusion from bright terrain reflections. Expectation. This viewing strategy reduces false alarms. Reality. Under rare solar geometry, even this strategy can be fooled if reflected sunlight enters the sensor pathway at the wrong angle. Molniya-type highly elliptical orbits are used because they give long dwell time over northern latitudes, supporting persistent views of missile fields. This is an engineering trade, coverage and geometry versus stability of background conditions. The satellite spends most of its orbit far from Earth, peering down at the northern hemisphere for hours at a time. The view angle is shallow, looking across the curve of the planet toward its edge. This geometry is intentional. It allows the sensor to see missiles as they rise, backlit by space, rather than lost against the brightness of the Earth's surface below. But the same geometry that helps detection creates a special case background the algorithm must understand. On the night of 26 September, the autumn equinox period creates a solar angle that, when paired with the satellite's position and high-altitude clouds, produces an infrared signal the system cannot distinguish from a missile launch. Sunlight glints off cloud tops at just the right angle to enter the sensor's field of view, with an intensity profile that matches closely enough the profile of a rocket exhaust plume. The algorithm's confidence comes from pattern matching. It has been trained on examples of real launches, test firings, simulations, and intelligence on US missile characteristics. When the sensor detects a bright infrared source at the Earth's limb, rising against a dark background, the pattern matches. The classification logic flags it as a launch. The confidence level is high because, under most conditions, the pattern is distinctive. Cloud reflections are not supposed to mimic this signature. The system's pride automated classification becomes a liability. The first step of the chain is too confident. It does not know it is wrong. And because it does not know, it presents its conclusion without caveats. The display does not say, possible launch, low confidence. It says, launch detected, highest reliability. The language is declarative. It demands action. Petrov faces a console that insists reality has changed. 5 launches are indicated. The system is not hedging, it is not suggesting, it is asserting. And the assertion flows from a design choice: sensitivity over specificity, speed over deliberation, automation over doubt. The verification gap is not merely a timing issue, it is a conceptual challenge. How do you know what you're seeing is real when the only source of information is the instrument that might be failing? The answer, in principle, is independent corroboration. But corroboration takes time, and time is the resource early warning is designed to eliminate. On this night, the algorithm's pride becomes a test of human judgment. The machine says, launch. The operator must decide whether to believe it. And the stakes are measured not in personal consequences, but in the possibility that his report could set in motion actions that escalate toward war. The system's design reduces some false positives by looking at the Earth's edge, but on 26 September, that very geometry becomes the vulnerability. A specialist review emphasizes that an operator at the space segment is not the launch authority. Instead, there are multiple assessment layers above the satellite command center, culminating in the general staff. Public narratives often compress decision-making into a single heroic moment. The documented reality is bureaucratic and therefore dangerous in a different way. Multiple layers can catch errors, but they can also accelerate readiness actions if each layer treats the previous one as validated. The warning chain is designed with redundancy. Sepukov 1.5 reports to higher command posts within the Air Defense Forces. Those commands assess the alert and, if warranted, inform the General Staff. The General Staff, in turn, briefs political leadership. At each stage, there is an opportunity for skepticism, for additional checks, for corroboration, but there is also pressure. Each layer exists to move information upward quickly. The system is built for speed, and speed, by design, limits the time available for doubt. The near miss is an institutional false certainty moving through layers under time pressure. A phone call or report channel becomes the decisive actuator, not a launch key, but a classification statement. Attack reporting accelerates decision-making. False alarm reporting slows it, yet slowing it is itself a risk if you're wrong. The protocol logic is a flowchart: alert, classification, upward report, leadership consultation. The design assumes that if a satellite detects launches, the information must move quickly to those who can order retaliation. The assumption is rational in the context of genuine attack, where minutes matter. But it is dangerous in the context of false alarm, because the same speed that protects against surprise also compresses the window for recognizing error. Petrov's choice of words becomes critical. He reports that the system is malfunctioning, that the alarm is false. The phrasing prevents immediate escalation. Had he reported missile attack, the chain would have activated differently. Communications would have opened to higher levels. Readiness steps would have begun. Even if subsequent assessment revealed the alarm to be false, the actions taken in the interim force movements, alert status changes, command post activations could have been observed by Western intelligence. And those observations, in a tense period, could have been misinterpreted. The console now shows not merely one event. Accounts describe it as 5 missiles. The number is small by strategic standards, too small, in fact, to constitute a credible first strike. This is the paradox Petrov seizes upon. A genuine U.S. attack would be massive, designed to destroy Soviet retaliatory capability in a single blow. Hundreds of missiles, not 5. Thousands of warheads, targeting missile silos, command posts, and strategic forces. The doctrine is clear. First strikes aim for strategic paralysis. 5 missiles make no sense. They cannot achieve strategic objectives. They are enough to cause catastrophic damage to 5 cities, but not enough to prevent Soviet retaliation. Any rational attacker would know this. The mismatch between the reported scale and the expected scale becomes the most important data point Petrov has. It is not in the sensor feed, it is in strategic logic. His documented reasoning, preserved in interviews conducted years later, hinges on this mismatch. When people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. You can do little damage with just 5 missiles. The logic is plain, almost banal, but it is correct, and it provides a basis for contradicting the machine. The choice of words system malfunction rather than attack prevents immediate escalation. The next question is not who was right, it is what did the satellites actually see. In this architecture, the radar horizon is not a minor detail. It defines when proof becomes physically available. A satellite can cue first, radar confirms later. Expectation. Independent confirmation arrives in time to prevent catastrophic misinterpretation. Reality. The confirmation window is exactly where decision-makers can overreact. The radar path remains silent, exactly the mismatch Petrov will use as a brake. Operators wait for corroboration that cannot physically arrive instantly. Viewers might assume radar confirms everything immediately. In reality, radars see warheads only after they rise above the Earth's curvature, creating a window where satellite says, launch, but radar cannot yet confirm. The timeline is dictated by physics. A missile launched from the central United States follows a ballistic trajectory that carries it up through the atmosphere, over the Arctic, and down towards Soviet territory. The boost phase when the rocket engines are burning lasts only a few minutes. During this phase, the missile is visible to satellite infrared sensors, which detect the heat of the exhaust plume, but the missile is below the radar horizon for Soviet ground stations. The Earth's curvature blocks line of sight. As the missile continues upward into its mid-course phase, it eventually rises high enough to be detected by Soviet radars. The exact timing depends on the missile's trajectory, the location of the radar, and atmospheric conditions. For ICBMs targeting Soviet territory, the flight time from launch to impact is typically around 25 to 30 minutes. Radar confirmation might arrive 10 to 15 minutes after launch, halfway through the flight. The gap between satellite detection and radar confirmation is the decision window. It is also the danger window. Because verification is delayed, procedure may weight satellite alerts heavily unless a human intervenes. The system is designed this way intentionally. If decision-makers waited for radar confirmation before acting, they would lose precious minutes. The purpose of satellite early warning is to extend the timeline, to give leaders the maximum possible time to assess an attack and prepare a response. But extending the timeline also means creating a period when the only source of information is the satellite, and if the satellite is wrong, there is no immediate way to know. Petrov now must decide whether to let an unverified satellite alert become an official attack report. The protocol says report, his training says report, the system's confidence level says report, but his operational experience says wait, and his strategic intuition says the pattern doesn't fit. The verification gap concept is central to understanding why the Petrov incident is dangerous. Satellites may indicate a launch before ground radars can confirm, due to the Earth's curvature and radar line of sight. In a launch warning architecture, classification decisions propagate upward faster than independent verification. The system will soon claim 5 launches, but the bunker can't independently see what the satellite thinks it saw. The absence of radar confirmation is not, by itself, proof the alarm is false. Radar might simply not have had time yet, or the radars might be looking in the wrong direction, or atmospheric conditions might be degrading performance. In principle, a duty officer should not wait for radar confirmation before reporting a satellite alert, because waiting defeats the purpose of having satellites. But Petrov judges that the absence of confirmation, combined with the implausible scale, is enough to classify the event as false. That classification changes what superiors do next: monitor rather than escalate. The decision is not to ignore the alert entirely. It is to treat it as a technical anomaly requiring investigation, not as an attack requiring immediate readiness actions. Specialist analysis notes that even if a false alarm moved upward, the most radical plausible consequence is a preliminary command or readiness step, and that is still strategically dangerous in a war scare. If the system had shown hundreds instead of 5, even technical assessments note the outcome could have been different. The duty officer treats the situation like an anomaly investigation. What would a real first strike look like? Doctrine anticipates worst case. Petrov focuses on internal inconsistency. The reported scale is too small to match a rational first strike scenario. This is false positive management as an engineering concept. Sensitivity versus specificity, rare condition misclassification, and why multi-angle confirmation exists. His checklist is not formal, but it is systematic. Scale: 5 missiles cannot achieve strategic objectives. System maturity: OCO is new, and new systems have higher false alarm rates. Corroboration: radar is not confirming, and the timeline suggests radar should have seen something by now if the launches were real. Threat logic: the United States has no rational reason to launch a small salvo that guarantees Soviet retaliation while failing to suppress it. Later commentary notes that Soviet command may have been reluctant to start a war based on a new and unique system. The phrasing captures the institutional caution that likely protected the chain from escalating. A mature system with a long track record of reliability carries more weight. A system that has been operational for only months, and that is known to be still undergoing testing and calibration, carries less. The duty officer's report that the system is malfunctioning is not wild speculation. It is a reasonable hypothesis when facing an unprecedented alert from an immature sensor. The decision framework Petrov applies can be reconstructed from his later statements and the documented facts of the incident. First, he assesses the threat model, AUS. First strike, if it were to occur, would aim to destroy Soviet retaliatory capability. That means targeting missile silos, bomber bases, submarine pens, and command posts. It means saturation, overwhelming defenses, and ensuring no significant retaliatory force survives. 5 missiles cannot do this. 5 missiles, even if perfectly targeted, can destroy 5 assets. The Soviet Union has thousands of assets. The math does not work. Second, he considers system behavior. The OCO satellites are providing infrared data. That data is being processed by automated classification algorithms. Those algorithms are new. They have not been extensively tested against the full range of environmental conditions the satellites will face in orbit. False alarms are a known risk in any detection system. The question is whether this looks like a false alarm or a real event. The lack of radar confirmation, combined with the implausible scale, points toward false alarm. Third, he weighs the cost of error. If he reports attack and is wrong, he initiates a chain of readiness actions that could lead to strategic instability. If he reports false alarm and is wrong, Soviet leadership loses minutes of warning time, but they still have the capability to retaliate after impacts are confirmed. The asymmetry in consequences favors caution when the evidence is ambiguous. Petrov classifies the event as false. That classification changes what superiors do next monitor, rather than escalate. The classification does not stop information from flowing upward entirely. Higher commands are informed that an alert has occurred and that the duty officer assesses it as a malfunction, but the language matters. Malfunction invites investigation. Attack invites action. The uncomfortable conclusion is procedural, not heroic. Nuclear risk can be manufactured by information systems under deadline, even when nothing is physically happening. The system's confidence becomes misleading. A rare environmental configuration becomes a system-level false alarm. The console predicted an incoming strike. The physical world never confirms it. The decision does not end the incident. For the next minutes, accounts vary on the exact duration, but suggest roughly 20 minutes. The command post remains in a state of elevated alert, monitoring for corroboration. Radar stations are queried. Communications channels are kept open. The satellite feed is watched for additional indications. The process is tense, but it is controlled. The classification false alarm has bought time, and time, in this case, allows reality to assert itself. No radar tracks appear, no detonations occur, no impacts are recorded. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence. The alert is confirmed as false. The system is logged as having malfunctioned. And the incident, in the immediate aftermath, is treated not as a near miss with global consequences, but as an operational problem requiring technical review. If the system had shown hundreds instead of 5, the outcome could have been different. The scale paradox, too few to be credible, is what makes skepticism possible. The story pivot is not cinematic, it is procedural. Petrov reports upchain his assessment that the alarm is false, an action a specialist source calls the right thing, even while challenging the simplistic saved-the-world framing. Expectation. Automated classification is trusted designers take pride in computer assessment. Reality. The algorithm is wrong, and the human must contradict the system's confidence. There is absolutely no reason to doubt Petrov's account of the events. He did the right thing when he reported that the alarm was false. The phrasing is deliberate. It credits judgment while acknowledging that the outcome was not preordained. The system provided bad data. The operator recognized it as bad. The recognition prevented escalation, but the recognition was possible only because the data was implausible on its face. The report upward is the decisive moment not because it stops anything directly, but because it shapes how higher echelons interpret the situation. The warning chain is designed to move information quickly. That speed is protective in the case of genuine attack. It is dangerous in the case of false alarm. What slows the chain is classification. Labeling the event as attack accelerates. Labeling it as malfunction decelerates. Petrov's report does not eliminate uncertainty. It introduces a competing narrative. The satellite says, launch. The duty officer says, false alarm. Higher commands must now decide which assessment to credit. In principle, they could override the duty officer and treat the satellite data as definitive. In practice, they do not. The implausibility of the reported scale, combined with the lack of radar confirmation, supports Petrov's assessment. The decision chain chooses caution. This report helps shape what higher levels do next, treat it as technical anomaly, and wait for physical confirmation rather than escalating conclusions. The countdown is not to launch, but to whether detonations or radar tracks appear, and the system's credibility is on trial in real time. The institutional context matters. Soviet nuclear posture in the 1980s is structured around assured retaliation. The strategic concept is deep second strike, the ability to absorb an attack and retaliate from surviving forces. This posture implies that Soviet decision-makers would not launch based solely on a satellite alarm, especially one that is unconfirmed by radar or other intelligence sources. They would wait for confirmation. They would assess intent, They would verify the scale of the attack. Launch on warning is a theoretical option, discussed in strategic literature, but it is not Soviet doctrine. Yet even if immediate launch is unlikely, preliminary command measures are plausible. These are steps short of launch but necessary for readiness. Opening secure communication links, activating alternate command posts, moving strategic forces to higher alert status, preparing launch procedures. These actions do not directly trigger war, but they increase the chance of war by creating observable changes that the other side might misinterpret. In a war scare, any change in force posture can be read as preparation for attack. The most radical thing Soviet leadership would do in response to an unconfirmed satellite alert is to issue a preliminary command. No missiles would be launched unless there were actual nuclear detonations or confirmed radar tracks of incoming warheads. But the preliminary command opens the door. It shortens reaction time. It increases the chance that a second false alarm or a misinterpreted US action could cascade into catastrophe. Petrov's assessment interrupts this chain. By classifying the event as false, he removes the justification for preliminary command. The satellite alert is not treated as intelligence requiring action. It is treated as a technical problem requiring diagnosis. The distinction is subtle but critical. Attack demands response. Malfunction demands investigation. The decision is not guaranteed to be correct. In principle, Petrov could be wrong. The satellites could be right. The launches could be real, and radar confirmation could be delayed by atmospheric conditions or targeting geometry. If Petrov misclassifies a real attack as false, Soviet leadership loses precious minutes of warning time. The cost of that error, in theory, is immense. But the cost of the opposite error, misclassifying a false alarm as real, is also immense. And in the context of September 1983, with tensions high and miscalculation fears explicit, the direction of error matters. A false negative delays retaliation but does not prevent it. A false positive accelerates readiness actions that can destabilize the strategic environment and increase the chance of accidental war. Petrov's choice reflects an operational judgment about which error is more dangerous at this moment. And the judgment, supported by the implausibility of the reported scale and the absence of corroboration, turns out to be correct. The alarm is false, the system is wrong, and the institutional response, monitoring rather than escalating, allows time for the physical world to disconfirm the satellite data. An investigator's conclusion replaces the alarm tone. The system was fooled by the environment. The system was built to detect hot rocket exhaust. It instead classified a lighting artifact as a launch signature. The Washington Post description points to high clouds reflecting sunlight as the trigger mechanism. PBS also ties the false alarm to the autumn equinox period and notes the Molniya orbit geometry. The root cause is environmental, not sabotage. No hostile actor tricked the system. No equipment failed catastrophically. The satellite sensors functioned as designed. The algorithms processed the data according to their logic. The failure was in the assumption that the viewing geometry and background conditions would reliably distinguish missile exhaust from natural phenomena. That assumption held under most conditions. But on the night of 26 September, the conditions were not most conditions. Sunlight glinting off clouds during a rare lineup becomes the technical explanation. The autumn equinox creates solar angles that maximize the chance of reflection. The Molniya orbit's high-latitude focus means the satellite is looking across a long atmospheric path toward the horizon. High-altitude clouds in that path can reflect sunlight into the sensor's field of view. The infrared intensity profile, brightness, duration, angular characteristics matches closely enough to the profile of a missile launch that the classification algorithm flags it as such. A rare environmental configuration becomes a system-level false alarm. The system's confidence becomes misleading. This is a known problem in sensor design. Rare conditions can produce signals that mimic the target signature. The solution, in principle, is redundancy, multiple sensors, multiple viewing angles, multiple phenomenologies. If one sensor sees a launch, check whether other sensors see it too. If they do, the event is likely real. If they do not, the event is likely false. The Soviet response, as described in later technical accounts, is to add cross-checking from a different viewing angle. PBS's technical narrative describes one institutional lesson. The Soviets added geostationary coverage to reduce the chance that sunglint could fool the system again. geostationary satellites orbit at a fixed position above the equator, providing a continuous view of a specific region. Their viewing geometry is different from that of mole-near orbit satellites. If a mole-near satellite sees a launch, a geostationary satellite should also see it from a different angle, under different background conditions. If only one sees it, the alarm is likely false. This is sensor fusion, combining data from multiple sources to improve reliability. It is also an acknowledgement that the ecosystem, as initially deployed, is vulnerable to false alarms under rare but plausible conditions. The fix is not perfect. Geostationary coverage does not eliminate all false alarm modes, but it reduces the chance that a single geometry failure will produce an uncorroborated alert. Apparently, the Soviet Union launched a new fleet of satellites into geostationary orbit simply to provide a second angle of view to confirm or refute alerts from the mole-near satellites. The cost is significant: additional satellites, additional ground infrastructure, additional data processing, but the cost of not fixing the problem is higher. The next false alarm might occur under different circumstances. The next duty officer might not be as skeptical. The next assessment chain might escalate rather than pause. Technical fixes solve physics problems, but they don't solve the strategic environment documented in 1983. Institutions were already primed to fear surprise. The lesson of the Petrov incident is not merely technical, it is organizational. Automated systems can produce confident wrong answers. Procedures that prioritize speed can compress deliberation. And human judgment, when it contradicts the machine, requires both expertise and institutional support. The fix after the fact is redundancy against sunglint. The broader lesson is that warning systems, by their nature, create risks as well as reduce them. They protect against surprise attack, but they also create pathways for error to masquerade as intelligence. The challenge is not to eliminate warning systems, they remain strategically essential. The challenge is to design them, and the decision processes around them, to tolerate ambiguity and reward skepticism when the data does not fit the expected pattern. PBS notes a systemic response. A second viewing angle helps reduce single geometry failure risk. The statement is technically precise and strategically significant. The Petrov incident exposes a design vulnerability. The response addresses that vulnerability. But the response also confirms that the vulnerability was real, that the system was fallible, and that reliance on automation without corroboration was dangerous. The root cause chapter closes with an uncomfortable recognition. The near miss was not caused by malice or gross negligence. It was caused by the complexity of the system interacting with rare environmental conditions. That makes it harder to prevent. It also makes it more likely to recur in different forms. Every sensor has blind spots. Every algorithm has edge cases. Every procedure has failure modes. The question is whether the institution recognizes this and builds checks accordingly. The absence of impacts becomes the final measurement. The console predicted an incoming strike. The physical world never confirms it. This is how the incident resolves, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet accumulation of negative evidence. No radar tracks, no detonations, no impacts. The satellite's prediction is disconfirmed by the passage of time. Radars never produce a confirming track in the required window. The timeline for an ICBM attack is fixed by physics. Missiles take approximately 25 to 30 minutes to fly from launch sites in the central United States to targets in the Soviet Union. If launches occurred at the time the satellite indicated, radar should begin detecting warheads within 10 to 15 minutes as they rise above the horizon. Command posts should see tracks. Operators should report inbounds. None of this happens. The absence is diagnostic. It is not proof that the satellite is wrong. Radar could, in theory, fail to detect a real attack due to technical problems or targeting geometry. But combined with the implausible scale and the lack of any other confirming intelligence, the absence of radar data shifts the probability decisively toward false alarm. False classification delays escalation long enough for reality to disconfirm the alert. This is the operational success, not preventing a launch because no launch was imminent, but preventing escalation of readiness posture in a strategic environment where escalation itself was dangerous. The return once more to the 5 missiles logic as the simplest sanity test against doctrine. When people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. The stand down is procedural. The alert status returns to normal. The satellite feed is examined for anomalies. Technical teams begin investigating what caused the false alarm. The duty log records the event. Reports are written. The incident does not become public. It becomes administrative paperwork, reprimand, secrecy. Petrov remains the only named floor actor in documented accounts. The system logs likely record the names of other personnel on duty that night, communications officers, technical staff, supervisors, but those names do not enter the public record. This is typical of classified operations. The narrative focuses on the decision-maker, not the team, but the decision is embedded in a system. Petrov's assessment is informed by the diagnostics his team runs, by the absence of radar reports from other posts, by the communications he has with higher commands. The incident does not trigger immediate policy changes. In the days and weeks that follow, the event is treated as a technical anomaly requiring investigation, not as a near catastrophe requiring strategic rethinking. The classification's secret ensures that the incident does not become part of the public discourse on nuclear risk. Western intelligence eventually learns of the event, but details remain sparse. The full story does not emerge until years later, after the Cold War ends, and participants begin to speak publicly. The absence of immediate recognition reflects a broader pattern in how institutions handle near misses. When disaster is averted, the tendency is to focus on the technical failure rather than the systemic vulnerability. The question becomes, why did the sensor fail? Rather than, why did we design a system where a sensor failure could trigger strategic escalation? The former is an engineering problem, the latter is a policy problem. Engineering problems get fixed, policy problems often do not. The Petrov incident proves that early warning, designed to prevent surprise, can itself become a source of strategic instability when sensors fail and procedures compress decision time. The near miss is not a single point of failure. It is a chain of vulnerabilities: sensor susceptibility to environmental conditions, automated classification without robust corroboration, procedural pressure to report quickly, institutional tension that reduces tolerance for ambiguity, and a strategic environment where readiness actions can be misinterpreted as preparations for attack. The resolution is anticlimactic. The satellite was wrong. The duty officer was right. The world did not end. But the lesson is not reassuring. The system worked barely. It worked because the false alarm was implausible on its face, because the duty officer had the expertise and authority to contradict the machine, and because higher commands chose to wait for corroboration rather than acting on ambiguous intelligence. Change any of those factors, and the outcome could have been different. A more plausible salvo size, say 50 missiles instead of 5, might have overwhelmed skepticism. A less experienced duty officer might have followed procedure and reported attack. A more aggressive command structure might have initiated preliminary readiness steps immediately, creating observable changes that Western intelligence could misinterpret. The incident is survivable because multiple things went right. That is not the same as saying the system is safe. The stand-down confirms that nothing was happening, but it also confirms that something almost did. A personnel disciplinary frame replaces the strategic one. What gets recorded, criticized, or buried. Public mythology expects medals. Documented summaries note Petrov was reprimanded, often described as for faulty documentation, and the event treated as secret for years. This is not unusual in military bureaucracies. Outcomes matter, but so does procedure. Petrov's assessment was correct, but his documentation, the logs and reports produced during and after the incident, was judged inadequate by his superiors. The Arms Control Association's summary gives clean narration beats: tense period, reprimand, secrecy. The incident occurs during a particularly tense period in the Cold War. Petrov is criticized rather than praised. The event remains classified for years. These facts, taken together, reveal an institutional response that prioritizes secrecy over learning. The Soviet military does not want the world to know that its early warning system produced a false alarm. The revelation would suggest vulnerability. It would undermine confidence in Soviet strategic posture. It would invite questions about the reliability of command and control. Secrecy delays broader learning. Fixes happen internally without public accountability. The technical response, adding geostationary coverage, addresses the immediate sensor geometry problem. But the procedural and strategic lessons are not disseminated. NATO planners do not learn that the Soviet system is vulnerable to false alarms. U.S. Intelligence does not learn the details of the incident. The broader public does not learn that the world came close to a catastrophic error driven by automated classification. The question is not whether Petrov saved the world. The question is whether his decision prevented escalation that could have increased the risk of war. The answer is yes. But the magnitude of that risk and the exact chain of events that would have followed had he reported attack remains uncertain. Soviet posture emphasized retaliation, not preemption. Preliminary command measures would likely have been the first response, not immediate launch. But preliminary measures in a war scare carry their own dangers. If the world didn't learn in 1983, how do we measure the incident's impact at all? The answer lies in later disclosures and system evolution. The incident becomes public in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapses and participants begin to give interviews. Petrov's role is recognized, though not universally celebrated. Some Russian officials dispute the saved the world framing, arguing that the system had multiple safeguards and that escalation was unlikely. Western analysts treat the incident as a cautionary example of how automation and time pressure can create catastrophic risk. The impact is measured in the slow accumulation of understanding about near misses. The Petrov incident joins a list of other close calls: the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1980 Titan II missile explosion, the 1983 Able Archer exercise, the 1995 Norwegian rocket incident. Each event reveals a different vulnerability. Together, they demonstrate that nuclear risk is not merely a function of adversary intent, it is also a function of technical failure, procedural brittleness, and human fallibility under stress. Petrov receives recognition late in life. In 2006, he is honored with a World Citizen Award by the Association of World Citizens. In 2013, he receives the Dresden Peace Prize. These are symbolic gestures, not official state honors. The Russian government does not celebrate his decision. The narrative remains uncomfortable because it highlights Soviet system fragility at a time when the system was supposed to be robust. Petrov dies in 2017 at age 77. His obituaries frame the incident as a moment when one man's refusal to follow protocol prevented a nuclear war. The phrasing is dramatic but not entirely accurate. Protocol was ambiguous. Petrov interpreted the alert as a system malfunction, which was within his authority. The decision was not to refuse orders, but to apply judgment when the data did not fit expectations. The lesson is not about heroic individualism. It is about the importance of expertise, skepticism, and institutional cultures that empower operators to question automated systems when those systems produce implausible results. The aftermath reveals an uncomfortable institutional pattern. Near misses are classified, participants are criticized, and lessons are learned slowly, if at all. The secrecy is strategic. No nation wants to advertise the fragility of its command and control, but it is also dangerous. If near misses are hidden, the broader policy community cannot learn from them. The vulnerabilities remain unaddressed. The next false alarm becomes more likely, not less. The reprimand and secrecy are not unique to the Soviet Union. Western systems have their own near misses, their own classifications, their own institutional reluctance to confront the implications. The pattern is universal. Complex systems fail in complex ways, and institutions struggle to acknowledge how close they come to catastrophe. A final graphic. Warning systems prevent surprise, but false positives can trigger catastrophe. The near miss wasn't caused by a reactor excursion or weapons accident. It was caused by sensor interpretation, plus protocol coupling, plus limited corroboration. The engineering lesson can be summarized clearly: single sensor geometry failure, need for multi-angle confirmation, operator training that empowers anomaly identification, and procedural designs that avoid automatic escalation from a single class of data. PBS explicitly frames the broader class of dangerous misinterpretations. The Petrov incident is one example. Other incidents involve training tapes mistakenly loaded into operational systems, atmospheric phenomena misclassified as missile launches, computer glitches that create phantom tracks. Each reveals a different failure mode. Together, they demonstrate that early warning systems, for all their strategic value, are also sources of risk. The closing line returns to Petrov's plain logic: you can do little damage with just 5 missiles. The statement is matter-of-fact, almost dismissive, but it encapsulates the core insight that prevented escalation. The scale of the reported attack did not match the scale required for strategic effect. That mismatch was the hinge. It allowed doubt, and doubt bought time. His classification delayed escalation long enough for the world to disconfirm the machine. The uncomfortable conclusion is procedural, not heroic. Nuclear risk can be manufactured by information systems under deadline, even when nothing is physically happening. This is the lesson that transcends the specific technical details of the Oko satellite, or the Molniya orbit, or the autumn equinox. It is a lesson about socio-technical systems operating under extreme time pressure with catastrophic stakes. The CIA monograph about the 1983 war scare frames the period as unusually explosive. The language is stark. Never in the years since World War II was the situation in the world as explosive as in the first half of the 1980s. The phrasing captures the strategic brittleness of the period, a moment when both superpowers maintained massive nuclear arsenals on high alert, when arms control was stalled, when tensions were acute, and when the margin for error was thin. The Petrov incident occurs at the intersection of that strategic environment and a technical failure. Neither alone would have been sufficient. A false alarm in a period of détente might have been quickly recognized and dismissed. A tense strategic environment without a false alarm would have remained tense but stable. The danger arises when technical failure and strategic tension coincide, when a system produces bad data at exactly the moment when institutions are primed to interpret ambiguous signals as confirmation of their fears. The enduring significance is not a single heroic lever. It is a documented demonstration that sensor physics, software confidence, organizational posture, and geopolitical tension can align into a near miss. The chain of causation is long and complex. The satellite's viewing geometry interacts with rare environmental conditions. The classification algorithm processes the signal and produces a confident conclusion. The duty officer receives the alert and must decide whether to believe it. The command chain above him must decide how to respond. The strategic environment shapes the threshold for action. Each link in the chain is necessary. Remove any one, and the incident might unfold differently. The technical fix, adding geostationary coverage, addresses one vulnerability, but it does not eliminate the class of problems. Future warning systems will have different sensors, different algorithms, different failure modes. The lesson is not to perfect the technology, because perfection is unattainable. The lesson is to design systems and procedures that are robust to false positives, that empower operators to question automated conclusions, that avoid automatic escalation from single-source intelligence, and that allow time for corroboration when the data is ambiguous. The most dangerous failures are credible false positives in time-compressed systems. This is the takeaway that applies beyond the specifics of 1983. As long as nuclear arsenals exist, and as long as they are coupled to warning systems designed to provide rapid alert, the risk of catastrophic error remains. The risk is not hypothetical. The Petrov incident proves it is real. And the fact that the incident was survivable does not mean the next one will be. The story ends not with reassurance but with recognition. Early warning protects against surprise attack. It also creates a fast lane for misinterpretation when sensors fail and institutions are primed for fear. The dual nature of these systems, protective and dangerous, is their defining characteristic. Managing that duality requires technical sophistication, procedural discipline, institutional skepticism, and strategic patience. The Petrov incident demonstrates what happens when those qualities are present. Other near misses demonstrate what happens when they are not. If you value fact-based nuclear history with primary sources on screen, consider supporting the channel.